U.S. Marines move through the desert of the Middle East. City after city falls to the troops, aided with powerful firepower, combined arms warfare, and local fighters. Their goal? To topple the country's regime and install a new leader in line with American interests. This sounds like something out of the 2000s, but it actually happened over 200 years ago, in one of America's most overlooked conflicts. Today, we often think of American foreign policy as very isolationist until the 20th century, and while this definitely has some truth to it, there are plenty of exceptions to the rule. The American Barbary Wars were America's first examples of foreign war, happening only a few years after the presidency of George Washington, who so famously called for American non-intervention. By looking more at this war, we can get a glimpse into America's early foreign policy and the attitudes towards intervention, the strategy of intervention, and how the early American military fought and disengaged effectively. All lessons that we can learn from today. So remember to like, comment, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and let's just get right into it. Once America won independence, the country's main security concern was overwhelmingly the natives. America had won the Ohio region in the Treaty of Paris, and Western settlers would be on the front line of near constant war for the next century as the country expanded. The Indian Wars were a direct security concern to the US, given natives would attack American settlements directly, but more than that, they were a real military concern as well. America's worst military defeat was at the hands of the Miami chief Little Turtle when he routed American forces at Wabash, killing or capturing 656 men. And it wasn't until the Civil War that many US service members would be killed in one battle. That being said, America still had other issues, one of the worst being the Barbary pirates. While we often think of pirates as Euro-Americans terrorizing the Caribbean, by this time in history, much of the piracy in the Western world was actually in the Mediterranean. 4 Islamic kingdoms, 3 of which were vassals to the Ottoman Empire, controlled most of the North African coast, and one of their key forms of income was state-sponsored piracy. Really just privateering against trade. However, the rich European nations could pay these states ransoms or protection money, ensuring that their nation's ships were safe. To boot, they had powerful navies to enforce their deals. England was one of those nations, but once the US became independent, American ships lost that British protection, leaving them open to piracy. Interestingly, one of these Barbary states, Morocco, was the first nation to recognize American independence, sheltering US ships from England as early as 1777. But the other 3 Barbary nations, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, modern-day Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya respectively, and then vassals of the Ottoman Empire, were less friendly. This was all made worse by the fact that American trade was heavily dependent on the Mediterranean. France and England were at war after 1792, and any attempt by America to trade with one would often result in attacks on American ships by the other, a cause of 2 wars in early America, and one of our earliest party divides. Go and check out a recent video I did on that. As such, lots of American trade went to the more pirate-threatened southern European countries, which weren't involved in the conflicts as much. As much as 1/4 of US cod and 1/6 of US grain exports went into the Mediterranean. When the pirates spotted American ships, they would fly a flag of a friendly nation and draw up close to the ship, pretending to simply be asking for directions or supplies or something. Then they would raise their true flag as they opened fire with cannons. Quickly closing the distance, they would board the ship, which was often undefended, taking the ship and its cargo, and usually enslave the people on board. These slaves would then either be put to work by the Barbary pirates or sold for money. The families or governments of these captured people could often pay ransoms to get these people freed, but the early American Republic struggled with this given its small economy. To make things worse, America didn't even have a standing military to defend itself, instead relying on raising conscripts in times of need. Debate raged in America on what to do about this. Hundreds of Americans had been taken as slaves by the Barbary states, and the threat to shipping could pose a serious risk to the new American economy. Even before the Constitution, America was asked for $132,000 from Tripoli. All of this was compounded by high insurance rates for U.S. ships, given their lack of a navy. The Founding Fathers also feared the pirates personally, as Jefferson refused to let his daughter travel to Europe because of them, and rumors swirled of Benjamin Franklin having been captured as well. President Washington, despite his belief that America shouldn't have a strong standing military, signed the Naval Act of 1794, commissioning the creation of 6 frigates for the U.S. Navy, which by this point had been totally decommissioned since the Revolution. Now, America had a navy, even if it was small, but it was a start. Still, the U.S. pursued treaties, i.e. ransom payments, with the Barbary states. In 1792, a $40,000 ransom was commissioned for Algiers. The payment was exorbitant and was delayed, and as such, Algerian pirates, again, we can call them corsairs because they were technically legal within the terms of their own country, began seeking out American ships until peace was reestablished 2 years later to the tune of about $1 million in goods, which was about an eighth of the U.S. federal budget. President Adams was similarly contradictory in his approach to the military. On his watch, an undeclared quasi-war broke out with France at the sea, and America's fledgling navy was starting to come in handy. To augment them, Adams recommissioned the Marine Corps in 1798. This force could not only undertake landing operations like it does today, but also fight on the ships during boardings, ensuring the enemy couldn't take the ship. But since he was preoccupied with France, Adams didn't feel he could afford a war with the Barbary pirates, and opted instead for paying exorbitant ransoms and pushing for peace. In December of 1799, the US agreed to an $18,000 a year ransom with Tripoli alone, close to 2% of the federal budget. And keep in mind, there's 4 of these states, right? So each of these things you're hearing, it's just for one of these 4 states. Oftentimes, the Barbary states were jealous, and if they saw another state getting more ransom from the US, then they would actually up their prices as well. By the time Jefferson was elected, the situation was getting out of hand. The ransom amounts were too high for the government to consistently pay, and the delays of payment in full were angering the Barbary states. Tripoli in particular was upset, and even called for a down payment of $225,000 as recompense, which the US of course could not accept. And then 2 things happened at once. Keep in mind that at this time news moved pretty slowly. Generally speaking, it took a month or more to cross the Atlantic, and this international conflict was largely defined by these limitations. Jefferson at first tried to maintain peace via intimidation, and had an expedition of naval ships under the command of Commodore Richard Dale. Dale's orders were to pay some tribute and deliver a letter to Tripoli indicating American hopes for peace. But at about the same time, in March of 1801, Tripoli declared war. Of course, the Americans figured something like this could happen, so Jefferson instructed Dale that if he should learn that war had been declared, he should engage Tripolitan ships in self-defense and blockade their harbor. Full-scale offensives were not allowed, since Jefferson had not gotten congressional approval. By that summer, Dale's expedition arrived at Gibraltar, where they had learned from other sailors that Tripoli had declared war. Not long after, America began to build a coalition. Sweden's navy was already partially blockading Tripoli, and Dale's effort also received help from Naples. On August 1st, 1801, the U.S. Navy had its first engagement with the Tripolitan ship Tripoli with the schooner Enterprise. After multiple foe surrenders, the Americans were able to win the battle with no casualties, while the enemy had 30 dead and 30 wounded. Due to the rules of engagement, the USS Enterprise had to let the pirate ship retreat to safety once the battle was won. Here I want to take a brief aside to focus on the naval warfare of this period. The pirates used a different approach than most European powers at the time, since their main objective was taking unarmed ships rather than fighting these prolonged attritional battles. Armed with a few cannons, the corsairs relied on boarding enemy boats rather than sinking them. With large, well-armed crews, the corsairs would try to get in as close as possible before engaging the enemies, maximizing their ability to board. To counter this, many U.S. Navy vessels kept Marines on board to fight them off in the event that that distance was actually closed. The American Navy, however, relied on advanced European-style tactics in ships to fight. Largely due to the nation's seafaring culture and hundreds of years of trade with England, the American naval vessels were built better than their European counterparts. Since the US had to have a small navy, it prioritized using frigates, which could overpower many ships and yet remain fast enough to outrun larger European warships. To quote Henry Knox, the US Secretary of War at the time, the frigates, quote, separately would be superior to any European frigate of the usual dimension, that if assailed by numbers, they would always be able to lead ahead, that they would never be obliged to go into action but on their own terms, except in a calm, and that in heavier weather they would be capable of engaging double-decked ships. Turning to Joshua Humphreys, the first U.S. naval ships were given a unique design. These ships were stronger than other frigates, yet maintained much of their speed and maneuverability. Humphreys' design was longer and narrower while also having more guns. It was strong and punched above its weight, but could still flee from larger ships if needed. With Marines to boot, the Americans could easily defeat any corsairs that they encountered. Although keep in mind that not all of the U.S. Navy ships as the war went on were these frigates. The frigates were kind of the biggest ships. There was lots of gunships, which would just have one gun on them, and many converted civilian ships as well. After the defeat of the Tripoli, the war was fully on. Dale blockaded the Tripolitan port alongside the Swedish, although the degree to which this was effective was debated. In any event, disease began to plague the American ships, including Dale himself, and the blockade was abandoned in September of 1801, just a month after the first engagement. The next year, Jefferson got approval from Congress, allowing for a more aggressive pursuit of the war. On February 6, 1802, the, quote, Act for the Protection of Commerce and Seamen from the U.S. against Tripolitan Corsairs was passed and allowed Jefferson to send larger war parties with offensive rules of engagements. Under Richard Morris, 5 frigates were sent to the Mediterranean to renew the campaign. However, 1802 largely came and went with little in the way of progress or major battles. Morris had spent most of his campaign in Gibraltar, and he was eventually replaced for his lack of action. Further, Morocco had joined the fight against America on June 19th, making this war a 3v1. When war resumed the next campaign season, disaster struck. On October 31st of 1803, the USS Philadelphia, which was guarding the Tripolitan harbor, attempted to engage a corsair ship. During this pursuit, the Philadelphia bottomed out on an uncharted reef and was stranded. The steep angle of the ship in the water made it impossible for it to use its cannons effectively, and the corsairs closed in on the larger frigate. Cornered with no way of fighting back, the ship's captain, William Bainbridge, surrendered. This was actually the second time that he had had to surrender. The Philadelphia's whole crew was imprisoned, while the ship itself was quickly recovered by the corsairs and brought into the harbor for repair to be used as a ship against America. The American forces in the region, now under the much more aggressive Commodore Edward Preble, had to make a call on what to do. Aided by letters written in invisible ink by Bainbridge, who was still in captivity, the Navy was able to develop a picture of what the Tripolitan harbor's defenses were. Many of the gunships in the harbor had been drawn up to shore for the winter season, and thus made the city more vulnerable. The Philadelphia remained on the water, still under repair. Armed with intimate knowledge of their target, Preble tasked Captain Stephen Decatur with carrying out the mission. Using a captured Tripolitan ship, the Americans posed as Maltesians, while Decatur's force of 75 men hid below deck. Approaching the Philadelphia on the night of February 16, 1804, the disguised crew asked to hitch to the frigate for the night on account of them losing an anchor. As they drew near, the small crew of the Tripolitan Guards realized what was happening. Acting quickly, the American crew boarded the Philadelphia and fought the guards off. They then proceeded to set incendiary charges along the whole ship before quickly fleeing the harbor. The Philadelphia went up in flames, while the Americans escaped with only minor burn wounds as casualties. When word of the Philadelphia finally got back to the US, both its capture and then its destruction, Congress doubled down and gave Jefferson even more resources to fight the war. This ramping up of aggression also quickly forced Morocco out of the war, since they didn't have a strong navy and had a better history with the US than the Ottoman protectorates. Preble's more aggressive tactics would culminate in the Battle of Tripoli, a series of engagements that caused heavy damage to the city and its fortifications. In July of 1804, Preble was given 6 gunboats by Sicily. While powerful and armed with a long 24-pounder iron cannon in the bow, the ships were primarily made for harbor defense and actually had to be towed across the open Mediterranean. Importantly, Preble also had 2 bomb vessels armed with 13-inch sea mortars. While less effective at sea battle, they were great for bombarding large stationary targets like the city of Tripoli. Along with the frigate USS Constitution, 3 brigs, and 3 schooners, Preble had the firepower to threaten the Tripolitan Navy and damage the city. In the afternoon of August 3rd, Preble bombarded Tripoli with the bomb ships, while the city's defenses and ships opened fire on the American squadron. Moving to intercept them, the American gunships attacked their Tripolitan counterparts, killing dozens, sinking 3 ships, and capturing another 3. The US sailors and Marines fought valiantly as they boarded the enemy ships, and only one American, John Decatur, the brother of Stephen, was killed. 2 hours later, the Americans disengaged, but they would be back. 4 days later, an attack was made on the western part of the town where a Tripolitan battery was destroyed and bombardment of the city continued. However, one of the American prize ships taking part in the battle took a lucky shot in the magazine. This time, the Americans lost 12 men and 2 gunboats. On August 24th and 28th, the US bombarded the city at night, and the final battle took place on September 3rd. With the gunboats pinning enemy ships in the harbor, the bombers continued to fire along with the USS Constitution, ultimately doing significant damage to some of the batteries. The next night, a firebomb ship was sent in at night, but it detonated early, only sinking one other gunboat and killing the American crew. The results were indecisive despite the significant casualties brought upon the city, and America had to figure out another tact. This time, the US Marines would lead the charge. Since 1802, William Eaton, actually a diplomat and army officer, not a Marine, had toyed with the idea of regime change in Tripoli. The Basha, or leader of the state, Yusuf Karamanli, had actually illicitly taken power from his brother years before. His brother and the rightful heir to the throne, Hamid Karamanli, was in exile in Egypt while his family was held hostage in Tripoli by the Basha. Eaton believed that a successful military campaign could usher Hamid to power and bring peace between America and Tripoli. His plan was finally approved, and he set off for the Mediterranean in 1804. In November, he landed in Alexandria, Egypt, but he had difficulty finding Karamanli. By February, Eaton had found him further south, along with a retinue of 40 warriors, and returned to Alexandria. Over the course of the next week, preparations were made for a westward march across the desert to attack Tripoli, with Karamanli gathering Bedouin and Berber forces, and Eaton organizing the American contingent. The American land force was very small, consisting of Eaton, 7 Marine enlisted men, 1 Marine officer who was Lieutenant O'Bannon, and a Navy midshipman. Karamanli, meanwhile, had established a much larger force, including about 300 mounted Arabs and 70 Christian mercenaries. On March 6th, the combined force set out into the desert, making 40 miles on their first day. However, they ran out of water, and the well that they were banking on was empty. For the next 2 weeks, the force slowly crossed the desert, barely surviving, until they encountered a Bedouin encampment on the 22nd, where they rested for 5 days and gained another 150 fighters, including 37 families to boot, further increasing the supply train for the group. Their struggles continued as they marched westward, with tensions flaring over a lack of pay, lack of food and water, and sectarian divides between Christians and Muslims. The two faiths often did not respect one another despite their shared goal. Pascal Peck, the Navy midshipman on the journey, wrote, quote, "When I think of our situation in the desert, where no other Christian has ever set foot, and considered what thieves the Arabs are, who would shoot a man for the buttons on his coat, and their religious prejudices, which would have been sufficient to warrant our deaths as Christians and enemies of their religion, I frequently wonder how it was possible for us to succeed." These struggles almost led to mutiny, but a show of force by the Americans plus the intervention of Karamanli prevented violence. Plus, an American supply ship had been spotted off the coast 40 miles away. It took another 12 days for the army to arrive at the city of Bomba on April 16th. Continuing on, the force finally arrived outside of its first military target of their operation, the fortified city of Derna. Eaton tried to negotiate the city's surrender, but they refused, and preparations were made for a battle. The city had a force of 945 cavalry and 1,250 infantry, plus a 10-inch howitzer and 8 sea-facing guns in a fort. By contrast, Eaton's total force was around 530 men total, at least 300 of which was cavalry. However, Eaton had 3 ships, the brig Argus, schooner Nautilus, and sloop Hornet, to bombard the city from the sea. He also had artillery stored on the ships, but due to the cliff-like nature of the shore, Eaton was only able to get one of those guns on shore for the attack. Eaton organized the attack on 3 fronts. One would be the 3 ships bombarding the fort, the Hornet at close range, and the Nautilus and Argus further off. From the southwest, Karamanli would lead the main Muslim force of 450 men, cutting off the road to Tripoli and then assaulting into the city and taking the governor's palace and howitzer. From the east, Eaton would lead the 80-man strong Christian force with their lone field piece and take the fort once the naval bombardment had softened it. At 12:45, the ships opened fire, and after an hour, the 8-gun fortress was largely abandoned by the Tripolitans. However, the land effort was less successful. Enemy forces inside and outside of the walls harassed the coalition force, and Eaton's lone field gun was incapacitated on its first shot when the Greek Christian gunners left the ramrod down the barrel. Under heavy musket fire from the walls and nearby buildings, Eaton decided to lead his force towards the fort, covered by the Navy ships who supported his advance. Despite being shot in the wrist, Eaton continued to command the advance, and within 45 minutes, Lieutenant O'Bannon, along with a replacement midshipman, raised the U.S. flag over the fort, the first time U.S. forces would do so on foreign territory. The coalition had the advantage, and the fleeing defenders moved to the west just as Karamanli's forces were beginning to storm the city and the governor's palace. The Americans turned the fort's guns into the city, and the enemy was caught in a deadly crossfire. By 4 p.m., the city was taken. Casualty numbers are actually hard to come by, with primary source documents citing 1 American dead, 1 wounded, as well as 12 Christians wounded, although another source claims there were 2 American deaths and 3 wounded, but without citation. There are an unknown number of deaths from the Muslim coalition or the defenders, but the deaths are likely in the dozens or hundreds, along with an untold number of civilians killed in bombardments. News of the victory reached Tripoli rather quickly, and the Basha sent a force to retake the city on the 13th, but it was repulsed. Now, the Basha was concerned that the war was becoming too costly, and the American executive consul, Tobias Lear, decided to step in and come to an agreement. Lear had been adamant about a diplomatic solution and strongly opposed Eaton's expedition in the first place. In return for an end to American hostilities, Tripoli would cease pirating American ships. In return for releasing all American hostages, the U.S. would pay $60,000, equivalent to about $1.5 million today. Further, The Americans were to convince the Basha's brother to halt his forces and evacuate back to Egypt in return for the release of his family. The Basha happily signed, and the war was over on June 3, 1805. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Lear's brokering of a peace, especially one that still gave monetary concessions to the Corsairs, was unpopular in many corners. Notably, Eaton had just begun to resume a march towards Tripoli when he was informed of the peace. Enraged, he was made to ferry the Americans, along with Karamanli, out of Derna back to Alexandria. The majority of their allies were left in the city and crushed by the Basha's forces later on. While the treaty with Tripoli gets the most attention, it's also worth noting that America came to separate pieces with Morocco and Algiers as well. Despite the US winning the war, they continued to pay ransoms for the next decade. Lear's peace only lasted 7 years, but to be fair, that was because the English encouraged Corsairs in the 1812 war against America. This would result in another, much shorter naval war, this time mostly with Algeria, which would seal the peace in 1815. So, what can we learn from the Barbary Wars, or at least what comparisons can we make between then and now? One potential takeaway is that in parts of the world, in this case the Middle East, there is a greater emphasis on the logic of force, i.e., it is hard to negotiate with Middle Eastern powers if they don't respect the military capability and will of another nation, since they don't have the same liberal world order norms as much of the West does. This is, of course, something people will debate all the time, and we're not going to answer the question definitively here. I think in the historical example, it is worth noting that this idea does have a lot of merit. The Corsairs were bolder in changing terms of ransom and agreements with the US than European nations, partly because the US actually had trouble meeting the demands financially, but of course it was partly because the US was not a credible threat, and the use of the Navy and Marines showed definitively that once there was a credible threat, the Barbary states played a lot nicer. Another theme we can look at is the internal disagreements within the US system. The stance the US took on pirates changed between administrations, and even within Jefferson's presidency, there was issues with congressional constraints, although these tended to go Jefferson's way as the war progressed. More toxically, due to the lag time in communications, the Mediterranean US elements weren't always cooperative. Morris was a terrible naval commander in 1802, and through 1805 there was tension between Lear and Eaton regarding the nature of how settlement would be achieved. In the end, Lear seemingly undermined Eaton's military success, which is something we'll talk about later. This has parallels with modern refrains of how the US military was doing so well in certain wars, especially Vietnam, but then the cowardly politicians sold out and lost the war. Again, we will get into this idea later. Regime change is yet another parallel between then and now. Throughout its history, the US has tried to use regime change as a method of bringing stability to a region, getting rid of an adversarial or unstable leader and replacing them with one more in line with US interests. Sometimes this was done through covert action, like in cases of Guatemala or Iran. Sometimes, though, direct military action was used. The most notorious example is, of course, Iraq in 2003. Other examples include Afghanistan, Libya, Grenada, and even World War II. I have a video talking about all the times the US has been at war as well, so check that out if you're interested. On the tactical level, we see yet another trend that has continued through recent wars, the OP nature of the American military. Part of this is because the US, since World War II, has been consistently fighting weaker nations, but still, the KD ratio for the US military was insane then and now. In the 1801 sea battle with Tripoli, the US killed 30 Corsairs and wounded another 30 with no casualties. In the first battle, the siege of Tripoli, the US lost 1 dead compared to dozens or hundreds of dead in return. In the same battle, a crew of 11 Americans boarded and took an enemy gunboat that had 36 enemies who were on the defensive. At Derna, the US lost 1 Marine while taking out hundreds of the enemy. The use of combined arms warfare was critical, as seen in Derna with sea bombardment combined with an infantry attack, and at the bombardment of Tripoli with a variety of fires brought on to the city, including gunships and mortars. And of course, all you need is a Google search of more recent conflicts to see those lopsided trends continue. Speaking of recent conflicts, especially Iraq and Afghanistan, we can see another parallel: the perils of withdrawing too early. Once again, both Iraq and Afghanistan were indicative of what can happen here. In Iraq, US forces withdrew in 2011. However, the nation was still extremely unstable, and not long after, ISIS began to take over large parts of Iraq, prompting US forces to enter yet again. In the case of the Barbary Wars, the US's withdrawal before full victory allowed the Barbary states to resume hostilities years later, prompting the US to once again use military action in 1815. More notoriously, US forces withdrew from Afghanistan in 2001, allowing the Taliban to overwhelm the government and resume control of the country. One of the key grievances with leaving Afghanistan like this was that many US allies in the country were left to fend for themselves and were subject to retaliation, demonstrating to the world that the US had no problem abandoning its allies when convenient. Similarly, in the Barbary Wars, the US forces abandoned their coalition at Derna, resulting in much of the force being destroyed by the Tripolitans, although at least the US helped Karamanli and his family. Related to this issue is arguably the most controversial question here: knowing when to withdraw, and it's here that I want to talk about some of the historiography around the war. Much of the narrative around this episode in US history echoes a sentiment that politicians and diplomats sell out the military and prematurely give up on a conflict. Of course, part of this can be true, and we see in the case of the First Barbary War that Lear was personally opposed to the increased use of military force, and that his peace terms may have been too lenient. However, we have to remember that in the case of any war, the war and the military are just one tool in the toolbox of a country to fulfill a wider goal. That goal of the nation needs to be concrete, and it of course needs to have some cost-benefit analysis attached to it. Once the problem is solved, ideally at the minimal necessary cost, you can and should call it quits on the military front. Not doing so is how you get forever wars, which have plagued the US in the Middle East. If we compare the Barbary Wars to Vietnam or Afghanistan, we quickly see that they are not really in the same category. In Vietnam, the US had a clear enough objective: preserve South Vietnam. As time went on, the US realized that goal was harder than expected, and it became increasingly escalatory, trying to save the country. Military aid turned into military advisors, which turned into direct military support, which turned into campaigns into neighboring countries. Nothing the US was doing was really working, and eventually it became clear that America was spending too much blood and treasure on this goal. It didn't matter that the US military was killing far more Viet Cong and NVA than before. The attrition wasn't winning the war, and so they had to go home. In the case of Afghanistan, the US had a very vague goal, which allowed for the presence of the nation far longer than it otherwise would have been. After all, it's hard to say exactly when you have won the war on terror. What could have been a war against AQ turned into one against the Taliban as well, and the ensuing insurgency, coupled with the inherent weakness of the US-backed Afghan government, meant that the US essentially had a blank check to stay as long as it needed, since their goal was so vague and theoretically unwinnable. But like in Vietnam, the US decided that that was enough, and withdrawal became necessary, even if the execution was botched. Regarding the wider war on terror, the US had similar issues. As quoted by Gideon Rose in a Foreign Affairs article where he quotes Philip Gordon, quote, "In Iraq, the US intervened and occupied, and the result was a costly disaster. In Libya, the US intervened and did not occupy, and the result was a costly disaster. In Syria, the US neither intervened nor occupied, and the result is a costly disaster." Rose then adds, "And in Yemen, one might add, the United States relied on drone strikes and active diplomacy, and the result is a costly disaster." In the case of the Barbary Wars, we see something different. The US's goal was not to eliminate the Corsairs, it was to ensure peaceful trade for US ships. If they could do that with treaties, they would. If war was needed, as Jefferson thought, they would do that too. The point of the war was not to depose the Basha, it was to get him to agree to peace terms. As it turns out, the taking of Derna was the minimum necessary force to do that. Also keep in mind that all the other states by this point had been pacified by treaties. While it could have been a better deal, again, I think Lear didn't drive a hard enough bargain, the US peace with the Barbary states held until the British got involved years later. This wasn't an example of the states just seeing the US as weak because they had a peace deal too earlier and going back on their word. This was an example of a proxy war by a superpower. There was extraneous circumstances going on here. This wasn't because of a weak peace deal. The narrative that the US quit while it was ahead, which in turn led to a renewal of war years later, in my opinion, is just false. Again, I think Lear could have gotten a better deal, and of course I personally would have liked to have seen a friendly regime installed, but the cost to do that, especially for the Tripolitan populace who would have been starved and bombarded, would have been quite high. The end of the First Barbary War was not an example of the cowardly politicians selling out the US military, but rather a successful limited military intimidation that forced the Basha into accepting what the US had wanted all along. America had a goal and it stuck to it, leaving when their goal was accomplished and preventing the Forever War, which John Adams had feared. Quote, "We ought not to fight them at all unless we were determined to fight them forever," was what he had said decades earlier, and fortunately he was wrong, at least this time. So that's it for this video, everyone. Hope you enjoyed. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, follow me on Instagram and X and all that fun jazz. Hope you have a great day. Remember to go out and vote. I just happen to be recording this on election day, so I don't know who the new president's going to be yet. You do. But have a great day and goodbye.